Welcome back to Ride JBI. This is JB. Today we're going to talk about the JBI Suspension Pro Valve. The JBI Suspension Pro Valve is a DIY revalve upgrade for the KTM 690 Enduro R, KTM 1190 Adventure R, KTM 1090 Adventure R, and KTM 1290 Adventure R model. The exact year fitment range is listed below in the video description and also on each product page at ridejbi.com. Early on in the suspension development for the KTM Enduro and Adventure models, it became apparent that some additional hardware needed to be changed out inside of these forks to further improve how well these forks can work. That additional hardware is including a subvalve inside of the base compression assembly. While only working with the parts there, I was able to somewhat improve the front forks, but not much without creating compromise somewhere else in the forks feel. To be specific about that, the stock WP-48 split fork, also referred to as the WP-48 rota fork, the base valve assembly, that is this piece right here, the stock one has a bleed shim directly after the piston. The piston would be this part of the assembly. By having a bleed shim as the first shim against the piston, it does not completely seal the piston, meaning the oil can always freely bypass the piston with little resistance until the fork is trying to push a much larger volume of oil through the piston. Then it begins to regulate that volume, aka give you compression resistance damping. Now, many riders found the front forks to be overly soft and mushy, and this was a combination of that type of valving on the base valve, again utilizing the bleed shim, and also some soft spring rates on the KTM 690R model and the KTM 1190R model. The 1090R and 1290R models received firmer springs, but the damping was never addressed at the base valve. They still utilized the bleed shim, which still gave the forks a overall mushy feel that would dive under braking, but not as much because of the firmer spring rates for those specific models. Now, you can remove that shim on the stock base valve assembly and you will gain a lot of hold up in the front forks. So the forks will ride higher in the travel and hold up much better during aggressive riding. Now the catch to this is that the forks are going to translate more feedback to the rider because the front wheel is not going to compress as easily as before when it first strikes obstacles such as bumps, rocks, roots, you name it. The JBI suspension resolves this issue by giving the oil 2 paths to flow through the base valve assembly instead of just one. If we look at our OEM base valve assembly, we'll see that we have a center bypass. It is hollow in the center of this. But if we follow that hole, we'll see that it enters into a cavity that is blocked off by this bolt. So the only path the oil has to flow through during compression is through our piston. It'll be through this hole, this entrance, and this entrance. So through the piston and deflecting our shims open. So with that one path, we're somewhat limited in our setup options And regardless of what we do, it's almost always going to be a give-take relationship. Meaning if we make the valve firmer, we will gain hold-up and embodiment resistance, but equally lose ride quality and comfort. The JBI Suspension Pro Valve gets around this by introducing an additional path for the oil to flow. This additional path or circuit for the oil to flow through is through a subvalve. Now, as we demonstrated earlier on the OEM base valve assembly, this is our piston post. You can see it has one hole in the center and it goes into a cavity that is blocked off by the bolt. The JBI Suspension Pro Valve turns our piston post into a valve. As you can see, this also has a hole in the middle, but we now have 4 small holes at the base of our piston post. So if we follow the path the oil is going to take, it's going to first go through the center of the post and fill up the cavity inside of here, which is contained by the bolt. And then the oil is going to come up through these 4 holes. We call this a subvalve. This type of valve is very common in many other fork damping types, such as a KYB SSS fork. A subvalve is stock in all of their forks. On Showa's twin chamber spring forks, a subvalve is stock on all of their forks. Subvalves are also now used in the WP cone valve fork since 2023, and Ride JBI has been producing subvalves for WP cone forks and also the air forks for some time now as well, because of the improvement that they provide to the damping system. So we now have the JBI Pro Valve assembly, and with that, not only do we have a shim stack for our piston, we have a shim stack that covers the holes on our subvalve. So instead of one path for the oil to flow through during the compression stroke, the oil now has 2 paths to flow through during the compression stroke. So let's go through the order of operations of what would happen when a wheel first hits a bump and the forks begin to compress. The oil is always going to take the route of least resistance first. So in the JBI Pro Valve, the oil will first go through the center of the Pro Valve subvalve body, fill up the cavity here, and then it is going to deflect the shims that cover the subvalve open. Now, the shims that cover our subvalve are very thin and very light in resistance. So while the shims do seal off our valve, it doesn't take much pressure to get these shims to deflect open. So what that means is it's hard for the forks to want to be overly soft and mushy because there is always initial resistance against the oil as you ride. Now, as the pressure builds, this shim can only deflect up and open so far and only allow so much oil to go through it. This is important because if a lot of oil was able to go through our subvalve, then the fork again would be overly soft. So instead, our subvalve first gives the oil some initial resistance but opens up rather easy, but it has a limiting factor of how much oil it ultimately can flow through the subvalve. So as the pressure builds, the oil then begins to push on the shims that cover our piston. And our shims at the piston next begin to deflect open, allowing the oil to pass through. Now, it is this seamless transition of pressure or oil flow, which gives the forks a much smoother feel overall, because now we always have initial resistance against the pressure to allow the forks to have good hold up and not dive. But we also give the oil a seamless transition between the subvalve to flow through and then the base valve piston to flow through as the pressure increases in the forks. On this type of fork, which is an open cartridge fork, it is best to increase the compression damping resistance at the base valve and not at the mid valve, because it is an open cartridge design, meaning there's not a lot of pressure inside of the cartridge to help the oil backfill through the valve, which can lead to cavitation issues. And this would lead to a poor performing fork. On twin chamber forks, where the cartridge is sealed and has its own pressurization system, we can then utilize a much more aggressive mid-valve compression setting without having to worry about cavitation. But that is not the case on the WP48 split fork / WP48 rota fork. It is an open cartridge fork. So by increasing the compression resistance at the base valve, this puts better positive pressure across our mid-valve piston inside of the fork cartridge. And this allows the fork to perform better overall and be more responsive due to less cavitation. The JBI Suspension Pro Valve is a cost-effective solution for improving the front fork performance overall on your KTM Enduro or Adventure bike.